Well, welcome, Melanie and Andy. We are here as part of a Kingsley Gate Partners in the Spotlight series. I'm Mike Bergen, and I lead the global HR practice, and Andy Davies leads the board practice for us in EMEA and is part of the global board practice. And our guest here, Melanie Hughes, is somebody that I've known for a lot of years. I consider a friend, and I consider one of the strongest thought leaders in our profession. Melanie has held a variety of chief HR officer roles, chief administrative officer roles throughout her career across a lot of very diverse industries, and brings some tremendous perspective. Most recently, Melanie has been the chief HR officer of Moody's globally. So welcome, both of you. And I'd love to start by asking Melanie, you have held several CHRO roles in your career. Do you think the perceived value of HR has been the same across those different sectors throughout your career?
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for inviting me here. Yeah, I have held a number of different roles in different organizations, and I do think there is a different perception of HR in the different sectors. And I'm going to make some generalizations here, which I'm going to caveat in advance, which is, there are always some organizations that are, at different stages in their evolution of HR and how they view the function, dependent upon the leader and the head of HR and how strong they are. So, as a general rule, though, what I have found is that in technology companies, the perception of HR and the way HR communicate, interact with, and are involved with the business is pretty different. And I think of HR as being almost on three levels. There's kind of this basic level of legal and compliance operations, keep the train on the tracks level. The second level of HR being providers and developers of talent for the business, and supporting the business in that way. And then kind of the highest level of being partners in the strategy of the organization, and the running of the business. And I would see technology firms very much at that first tier level. And I think it's because they rely so heavily on talent, and it's a scarcity. They recognize that culture is important, that they've got to think about employees as a major stakeholder in their business. So I would say technology, very evolved. I would say from a media, financial services, probably less evolved. I would say they operate at levels 2 or 3 in general. But again, I think there are many exceptions to that generalization, and it depends upon who the leaders are and how they're used to working with HR folks, because I think HR people have developed a lot over the last 20 years, and they're able to provide a better service. So very much dependent upon the people at the top of the organization.
And Melanie, I'm curious, you've been in this industry, in this profession for decades at this point. Have you seen all sectors evolve in terms of their definition of how the human resources organization and that human resources executive at the top of the house can impact the business in a more strategic way? Or are there some industries that just really haven't kept up at all?
Again, I have to be careful about generalizing, but I would say all industries have evolved to some degree, and I think they've had to, right? Especially over the last couple of years with COVID. And we can maybe talk a little bit more about that later. But I think if you don't treat your people as a strategic, critical resource now, you're going to have trouble executing on your basic strategy, because talent is scarce, and the talent is going to go where they're treated well, where they've got the right culture, where they're considered a good stakeholder in the business. And there's much more mobility for employees now, with remote working. People who might have thought that their ability to work was restricted very much by their geographical location, now not so much. So I think most organizations now are having to pay more attention to HR issues, human capital, culture, and engagement at work.
That's great. So I want to get to the concept of the chief HR officer and boards of directors, and hear certainly from you and Andy as it relates to that relationship. So love to hear your perspective on how you think that relationship with the modern day CHRO and the board, how should that look? And are we there yet?
Well, I would say it has to be a partnership with the comp committee, and especially the comp committee chair. And HR really needs to talk about the human capital components of compensation, not just the compliance element of it. And I think, when you're looking at the compensation committees of the board, they're starting to morph more into human capital committees in the more progressive companies. So where that's the case, you can actually have a very rich conversation about the compensation committee and compensation strategy, and is it really supporting the talent agenda to deliver on the strategy for the business? And I think once you start to have those types of conversations, it becomes more exciting for the committee chairs. You get a more holistic picture of what's happening in the organization, and your compensation strategy, yes, you've got to check all of the boxes around, understanding what ISS and Glass Lewis are looking for and understanding CEOs' pay and linking to performance, but is everything else supporting the human capital strategy? And I think the best relationships I've had with compensation committee chairs are those that have been interested in the human capital agenda. So I would say that's one big piece of it. I think a second piece of this is, the comp consultant has a big role to play as well. And really making sure that you involve the compensation consultant in these contextual conversations. And by doing that, I think, you're all aligned when it comes to looking at some of these big decisions that the organization is going to make. So for me, it's about thinking, I'd like to call it a human capital committee, not just a compensation committee of the board. So that would be one part of it. I think the board overall, the younger board members we're seeing really do understand human capital issues and want to get stuck into those. I think some of the more traditional board members who have perhaps come from a different generation before HR had evolved, perhaps view this in a different way.
Andy, you've got a pretty unique view of chief HR officer individuals working with boards on the other side of the pond. How does your perception of the relationship align with what Melanie's just described, which I think is mostly experience she's speaking to is in the US?
Yeah, I think it's very close. So firstly, Melanie talked about how HR is viewed in different sectors. And I'm a great believer that the job title that somebody has and where they sit in the organization is very formative. And so there are still organizations over here that would have a very dated job title, that of personnel director or personnel manager, and they may not even sit on the executive committee. But thankfully, those are very much in the minority. And I think the majority of chief executives now will want, at the very least, their CHRO on the executive committee, and maybe even on the main board. We're seeing organizations like Halma, which is a FTSE 50 organization, their CHRO is on the main board in an executive capacity. I don't think that's going to be a hugely upward trend, but I can see that happening increasingly. But I think, going back to what I said earlier, the breadth of the responsibility, putting people at the very center and the heart of the organization is absolutely now what is most important. And I think we're going to come on to this later, but COVID has really, if there's any positive of the pandemic, HR is certainly a function that has benefited from that, because HR directors, CHROs have probably for the very first time have been in some cases the most important people in the organization, and have been able to demonstrate a range of skills and develop a range of respect with both their peers, but also those further down the organization that perhaps wasn't there before. So I think really exciting that there's been an evolution which has been in time, but also COVID has maybe accelerated the perception of the very best at CHROs.
So I'll ask a question of both of you, and I'll be curious to hear how there may be differences depending on the region. Are CHROs set up to make good, strong, non-executive board members? And what's the trend that you're seeing in the marketplace? And, you know, Melanie, obviously you bring a unique perspective because you are British by birth, yet a lot of your career you've been based in the United States, but you also have been an executive in mostly global companies throughout your career. And then Andy, you obviously sit in London and focus more on the UK and then the European continent. So, you know, I'd love to hear both your answer around are CHROs necessary members of boards, not influencing them as an executive, but members of boards. What's the progress that we're making in these different markets, and do we still have work to do? So maybe Melanie, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think when you think about what a board's major responsibilities are, there are a large number of them that have a critical HR component. So CEO for succession, for example, you know, one of the most important duties of a board, C-suite effectiveness, compensation, governance, culture and ethics, and you know, all of these have an HR focus, but few boards have this kind of expertise. And if you compare this to the audit committee and the requirements people have for financial skills on the board, you know, it's interesting that you don't have this, you know, corresponding set of human capital skills required on the board. And so I think this is an area where boards could evolve very positively in the future. And I think also, you know, for most HR people, you know, collaboration and consensus building are skills that, you know, we mentor others in, and those are critical skills for board members too. So I see HR folks as having a really strong role to play in using their expertise in helping the board to function well and carry out its duties very effectively.
Do you feel like in the US we're making progress in that regard? Have you seen improvement over the last?
I haven't seen that many HR people on boards. And I'm not sure, and I looked at the statistics recently, and there's not been a huge increase in the number of HR people being placed on boards. But I wonder after COVID and maybe the focus the board has had to play on human capital and the HR person perhaps getting more of a spotlight in the board, whether that might start to change. I'm hopeful.
Good. Andy, same question to you.
Yeah, so we are in a very different place now, I think, in the UK and also in continental Europe. So it's not remotely unusual now for a CHRO, a serving CHRO, to be appointed to an external board as a non-executive director. In fact, I think it's welcomed. If anything, there is a shortage of qualified CHROs, and by qualified, I mean those that are doing the full remit or have the full remit of the modern day CHRO. And to some extent, they're reliant on the strength and vision of their chief executive to give them that remit. But I think, for a number of reasons, CHROs make fabulous non-executive directors. Firstly, they're going to add to the diversity of the debate around the board table. Secondly, naturally, they're going to put people at the very heart of any debate or conversation, which certainly with ESG and the way that organizations are moving, I think is critical. They are already qualified to sit on and in the future chair a remuneration committee. And as all of us know, that's become an area that you cannot get wrong, with the likes of Glass Lewis providing a lot of scrutiny and concentrated effort in those areas. It's not a subject you want to get wrong or have to get involved in a negative debate, particularly with activism only on the rise. So all of a sudden you've got somebody that is au fait with the issues, is qualified to sit on one of the subcommittees. The very best CHROs already connected to the business. And again, going back to their day jobs, if their own chief executive has already involved them in the runnings of their own board, and they've been asked to present in those situations, that then again, it's not going to be an alien environment to them. So I think we're only dependent now on CHROs being given that exposure by their own chief executives.
Yeah, Andy, as you talk to your clients, your CEO clients who have made decisions to bring HR executives onto their boards, what's the feedback been? Do they seem pleased with that decision? What do they have today that perhaps they were missing before they had HR professionals populating their board?
I think they're getting an added lens into the organization and looking at it from that people perspective. They're getting an insight into different parts of the operation, particularly organizations that have got large divisions or international businesses. Often CHROs are far more embedded in the culture of that organization. So again, they're getting a different insight. And then I think, also moving forward, the very best CHROs will not just be concerned with the traditional areas of HR, but they'll also be involved in strategic conversations. They'll be involved in M&A conversations, how the business is going to evolve, how the organization may need to adapt in terms of a future business model, particularly if technology is playing a part in that. So an essential skill set, which I think is becoming even more important as businesses continue to evolve and develop.
So fair to say, perhaps US boards have something to learn from some of the progress that's been made in the UK and the European continent?
Before Melanie answers that, I'm gonna. There is, I think, also a few reasons why we've seen that acceleration. If you look at UK and most European boards, 66%, so roughly 2/3 of CHRO positions are currently held by women. And yet, if you look at CFO positions, you'd be looking at between 10 to 15% held by women, and probably a similar figure for CEOs. So it's a well-known fact that in the UK in particular, we have a shortage of candidates that have had experience of the main board and are able to fill those non-executive positions. And so because we've got such a strong cohort of CHROs, it's an obvious place to look. In the US, I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Melanie, thoughts?
Yeah, I think also there's a fundamental difference between the way the US and the UK boards or governance structures view the people. And in Europe, employees are considered to be major stakeholders. They're not in the US. The board is there in the US to basically service the shareholders and serve the shareholders. In Europe, in many European countries, there are employees on the board, or there's a two-tier board structure where employees have a say. And when you've got the employees being instrumental in the governance of the organization and the decision making of the organization, they're treated as a different type of stakeholder, and therefore I think HR assumes a different level of importance. And I think in the UK, You have to have a designated board member that communicates the outcomes of the board meeting to the employees. And so, there is, I just think, a different perspective in European boards around the importance of the employee as a stakeholder. I think that's changing in the US, with all of our ESG movements. But I do think that, again, is another area where the HR component of a board, starts to take on a higher level of importance.
What do you think will help accelerate U.S. boards towards thinking that way? In other words, a COVID pandemic situation, is that the kind of wake-up call, perhaps, that we might need, as awful as that has been?
Well, I think when it's hard to do business, when you can't execute your strategic plan because you don't have the talent, and the talent will go where they feel they're an important stakeholder, I think that changes the minds of the business, perhaps more than anything else. Scarcity of talent and not being able to get the skills you need to execute in your business plan, I think, is a hugely motivational driver.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you've obviously worked with a number of boards at the different companies where you've held the chief HR officer role, Melanie. Have you ever had a former or sitting HR executive on one of those boards that you've worked with?
No, I haven't. No.
Telling, indeed. Yeah.
I've had various board members who have had a very, very strong interest in human capital and really had great relationships with their HR folks. And I do think the degree to which board members are interested in this subject matter area, this kind of expertise, has been driven a lot by the experiences that they've had with their own HR people. And Andy and I were talking a little bit about this before, and I think it's a big driver of people's respect for the function and the impact that it can have on the business.
Yeah. Andy, what are your clients asking for when you do have a client who perhaps specifically asks you to present a slate that includes human resources executives? What do they want out of that profile? What are the leadership qualities and behaviors that they value most in an HR professional? What are those business qualities and skills?
I think they're always most interested in the things that are what I've described as being beyond the CHRO job spec. So have they been involved in dealing or maybe even coordinating or managing a major event, some sort of heavy lifting? So clearly at the moment we have the example of COVID. So any chair who's recruiting is going to want to understand how the CHRO was involved in the planning at the outset of the pandemic and how they manage that through, because certainly most organizations, in my experience, the very best CHROs seem to have been absolutely at the helm of that process. So I think that's the first one. Secondly, looking for an interest in and expertise within whatever that business happens to be. Now, if it's a technology company, that doesn't mean we need somebody with deep technical skills, but somebody that has an appreciation of business and somebody that can talk strategy at board level, somebody that has a view and a valued opinion on how that particular market's going to evolve and change and what the threats and opportunities might be, but somebody that can have a business related conversation at the highest level. And then thirdly, a board ultimately is a team, but also remembering that every non-executive director is an independent. So it's getting the balance right. And what you find with the very best CHROs is that, unlike a lot of chief executives who are programmed to sort out the very problems that they see in front of them, it's not their fault, that's what they're programmed to do. The CHROs know where the line is between non-executive and executive, and they're able to step back or not encroach on the territory of the executive, and that's hugely important. particularly for management.
So Melanie, I'll put you on the spot here. No doubt you're a candidate for plenty of board seats. How do you, if you were sitting in front of a chair of a board, how would you best represent yourself as somebody that can help in an additive way to their board?
That's a great question, Mike. And I'm going to go back to what Andy was just talking about, which is, I've been involved in several of the companies I've worked at in writing the strategic plans for the organization. And that is because you have an interest in, you understand the business, you understand where it's going. You can think creatively out of the box about that. You can challenge people's thinking and help them get to a more evolved set of plans and thoughts. And so I think that's where you have to start, because all of your experience in the HR function is kind of a given. I mean, you shouldn't be sitting at the table if you can't do the basics around the compensation, culture, etc. I think you've got to show that you'll be a valued board member for other elements of that board discussion. And that's what I would. That's really what I would seek to portray, given I've actively been involved in the strategy set and actually been offered business positions in organizations because of that. And I think that's probably one of the most important qualities for looking for this. They want an all-rounder. They don't just want somebody who's going to chair that comp committee.
So a related question to both of you. We'll have a lot of people watching this episode who do aspire to sit on boards, and they're currently perhaps sitting CHROs, or maybe they're even earlier in their career. What's the advice we want to give those people in terms of what they need to do in order to build the resume, so to speak, to build towards that point where they would get strong consideration?
Mm-hmm. I would say, going back to that previous point, get involved in the business, be commercial. Understand what makes the business tick, where it's going. If you can get involved in the planning process around where the business is going, that is the best way to forge those relationships with the business and learn. If you're always a follower, if you're always just supporting those plans, not getting involved in the construction of them, then I think you're missing an opportunity. So get involved in the business would be my kind of number one consideration.
Great. Andy, anything you would add there? Yes, so definitely echo what Melanie said, and it's really along the same lines, which is look to broaden your remit, look to have an impact on as many different parts of the business as you can. I've been talking to a number of CHROs recently who are now coming out of the, let's call it the stress of the pandemic and beginning to return to a degree of normality. And they're all asking the same thing, which is, for 18 months, I was, if not the most important person, then probably, pretty much the most important person in the organization, with a much greater remit than I've ever had before. I don't want to go back to what I was doing before the pandemic. How do I stay ahead? And so I think, Melanie's advice there is spot on. Use that experience to further your education, to further your understanding of the business. You will have established, undoubtedly through the pandemic, an even better bond and rapport with your chief executive. Continue to build that. I think we're on the cusp now of seeing the second wave of change, and by that I mean we're seeing CHROs being appointed in their own right to the main board in executive positions. I think moving forward, the next step, as the CHRO remit begins to grow even further, I think we will see not increasing numbers, but we'll see certainly CHROs becoming chief executives. There's been a very well documented appointment recently, a lady called Lena Nair, who was the global CHRO for Unilever. has just been appointed as the CEO for Chanel. Lena is one of the best brand ambassadors that you'll ever meet. She's got a fantastic business insight. She's strategic. And ultimately, that's what the very best CEOs and CHROs are all about. So, as I said, I'm not saying it's going to be a hugely upward trend, but I think we'll see those moves happening increasingly.
That's great. We're close to the end here, and I think this has been a terrific session and quite informative. I could see us finding opportunity to do a follow-on, and if Melanie's willing, invite her back to have further discussion. But if I could, as we wrap up, I'll just throw it out. If there's any parting words that one or both of you would like to share before we close things out. Andy, you first.
So I'm always excited about the next generation of non-executive directors. And if I look at all the change that has happened in the last 10 years, and there's no reason at all why the increase of a new breed of non-executive director doesn't continue at the same pace. And I'm a great believer that if you want to learn about a business, then a non-executive director role is a pretty good way to do it. So if you're a CHRO who's listening and you're not doing a non-executive director position, go and talk to your board. They will absolutely see the benefit of you doing that. It'll give you the opportunity to learn about a non-competing, non-conflicting business. You're going to get a stimulation and a different sense of perspective that you're not going to get in the day job. And most importantly, you're going to bring those learnings back to the mothership and be an even better executive.
Awesome. Melanie, anything you want to close out with?
Maybe to say, I think the last 2 years has really seen an evolution for the CHRO and really elevated their position in both the executive committees and the board. And to Andy's point earlier, you don't want to go backwards from that. So, take this as an opportunity to leverage yourself and, ensure that you are involved in the strategic conversations of the business. And when it comes to board seats, it's not too early to start thinking about it at this point in time. I think we've got a unique point in time right now where CHROs have an opportunity to open those conversations with both their CEOs and with boards. So take the opportunity, and I wish everybody great luck who's watching this in finding a great board spot and
Wonderful.
Furthering the cause of the CHRO.
Without a doubt.
Well said.
Well, look, I want to thank both of you. I think this has been an incredible conversation, informative. No doubt anybody listening will take a lot away from it. So Melanie, we're going to not let you disappear in the future. We hope to have you back and cover some other really, really interesting topics. But for the time being, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for inviting me, Mike. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Melanie.